In the autumn of 1347, merchant ships drifted into the port of Messina in Sicily carrying more than silk and spices. Sailors lay gravely ill below deck. Some were already dead. Those still alive were feverish, weak, and marked by painful swellings. Within days of their arrival, people in the city began to fall sick in the same way. No army had invaded. No siege engines stood at the gates. Yet within 5 years, between 1/3 and 1/2 of Europe's population would be dead. This was the beginning of the Black Death in Europe, one of the most devastating pandemics in recorded history. The disease did not originate in Italy. Its roots lay far to the east, in the vast grasslands and trade corridors of Central Asia. The bacterium responsible, Yersinia pestis, circulated naturally among wild rodent populations. Under normal ecological conditions, it remained largely confined to these animal hosts. But the 14th century was an age of expanding trade. The Mongol Empire had secured large stretches of the Silk Road, connecting East Asia, the Middle East, and Europe. Caravans moved goods across continents. Ships crossed the Black Sea and Mediterranean with increasing frequency. Along with merchants and cargo traveled rats, and on those rats lived fleas capable of carrying the plague bacterium. By the early 1340s, outbreaks were reported in regions of China and Central Asia. From there, the disease moved westward along trade networks. In 1346, it reached the Crimean Peninsula. The port city of Kaffa, a Genoese trading outpost on the Black Sea, became a key transmission point. During a siege of Kaffa by Mongol forces, the disease spread among both the attackers and those inside the city walls. When Genoese merchants fled by ship in 1347, they carried infected rodents with them. The Mediterranean trade system ensured the disease would not remain localized. The arrival in Messina marked the first confirmed outbreak in Europe. Authorities attempted to isolate the ships, but the infection had already taken hold. From Sicily, it spread rapidly to Genoa, Venice, and Marseille. By 1348, the plague had reached Florence, Paris, Barcelona, and London. Within 3 years, it had penetrated Scandinavia and parts of Eastern Europe. The speed was unprecedented for the medieval world. The most common form was bubonic plague. Infected individuals developed high fevers, chills, and swollen lymph nodes known as buboes, often in the groin, armpits, or neck. Mortality rates were high, frequently between 50 and 60% among those infected. In some cases, the disease manifested as pneumonic plague, affecting the lungs and spreading through respiratory droplets. This form was often even more lethal. Medieval medicine offered little effective treatment. Physicians relied on humoral theory, which held that illness resulted from imbalances in bodily fluids. Some believed the plague was caused by corrupted air, known as miasma. Others attributed it to planetary alignments or divine punishment. Without knowledge of bacteria or vectors, communities turned to prayer, isolation, and ritual. In some cities, processions were organized in hopes of divine mercy. In others, fear turned outward. Jewish communities were falsely accused of poisoning wells, leading to violent persecutions and massacres in parts of Central Europe. These tragic events were driven by panic and misinformation during a time of widespread mortality. The demographic impact was staggering. Modern historians estimate that between 25 and 50 million people died in Europe between 1347 and 1352. Europe's population at the time was likely between 75 and 80 million. In many regions, entire villages disappeared from records. Tax rolls show abrupt declines in households. Agricultural land went untended as laborers died or fled. Clergy were heavily affected due to their role in tending to the sick. In some dioceses, a majority of priests perished. Replacement clergy were often hastily ordained, altering the structure and training of religious institutions. Monasteries and convents faced severe losses. Urban centers were particularly vulnerable. Crowded living conditions and poor waste management created environments conducive to transmission. Though sanitation standards varied, medieval cities lacked an understanding of contagion. The presence of rats in warehouses and homes allowed the disease to spread efficiently. Some municipalities attempted early forms of containment. The city-state of Venice introduced one of the first organized quarantine systems. Ships arriving from infected ports were required to wait offshore for 40 days before docking. The Italian term 40 giorni, meaning 40 days, gave rise to the word quarantine. While these measures were imperfect, they represented an early public health response. The economic consequences were profound. Severe labor shortages disrupted feudal systems that had structured European society for centuries. Surviving workers found themselves in higher demand. In England, the government attempted to freeze wages at pre-plague levels through the Statute of Labourers in 1351. Enforcement proved difficult. Over time, labourers gained increased bargaining power in some regions. Agricultural production initially declined due to loss of workforce. However, as population stabilized at lower levels, food availability per capita often improved. Land became more accessible to surviving peasants. In some areas, this shift contributed to long-term economic transformation. Social structures shifted as well. With mortality affecting all classes, though not always equally, traditional hierarchies faced strain. In certain cities, property ownership transferred rapidly due to inheritance. Guild memberships fluctuated. Women in some regions temporarily assumed new economic roles as widows inherited property or businesses. Culturally, the plague left a deep imprint. Art and literature from the later 14th century frequently reflected themes of mortality and transience. The danse macabre motif, depicting death as a universal force affecting all ranks of society, emerged in visual culture. Writers such as Giovanni Boccaccio documented contemporary experiences, providing valuable historical accounts. The Black Death did not end in 1352. It recurred in waves across Europe for centuries. Localized outbreaks continued into the 17th century. However, the initial wave between 1347 and 1352 remains the most catastrophic. The reasons for the eventual decline of the first wave are still studied. Possible factors include reduced population density, changes in human behavior, and shifts in rodent ecology. There is no single definitive explanation. What is clear is that Europe emerged demographically transformed. The plague also reshaped medical thinking over time. While germ theory would not be established until the 19th century, the repeated experience of epidemic disease gradually influenced urban planning and public health awareness. Quarantine practices expanded. Some cities improved waste management systems and regulation of trade. Globally, the Black Death was not confined to Europe. The Middle East and North Africa suffered significant losses. Trade networks ensured the pandemic spanned multiple continents. The interconnectedness that facilitated commerce also facilitated contagion. Modern science has confirmed that Yersinia pestis was the causative agent. Genetic studies of skeletal remains from plague cemeteries have identified the bacterium's DNA. Today, plague still exists in wildlife reservoirs in parts of Asia, Africa, and the Americas. It is rare and treatable with antibiotics when identified early. In 1347, none of that knowledge existed. Communities confronted an invisible and poorly understood threat with limited tools. The speed and scale of mortality challenged existing religious, political, and economic systems. It was not simply a health crisis but a structural shock to medieval civilization. Between 1/3 and 1/2 of Europe's population died within approximately 5 years. No medieval war produced comparable losses. No famine spread so widely or so quickly. The Black Death exposed the vulnerabilities of interconnected societies. Trade had brought prosperity and growth. It also carried disease across continents. When the first ships arrived in Sicily in 1347, few could have predicted the magnitude of what would follow. By the early 1350s, Europe's demographic map had been permanently altered. Generations grew up in communities defined by absence, empty fields, abandoned homes, and memories of loss. Yet from this devastation emerged transformation. Labor systems shifted. Economic mobility increased in certain regions. Cultural expressions evolved. The continent did not collapse, but it was changed. The year 1347 marks the moment Europe encountered one of the most lethal biological events in its history. The Black Death did not distinguish between noble and peasant, merchant and farmer. It moved through ports and villages alike. When it subsided, Europe faced the task of rebuilding not just its population, but its institutions and worldview. The pandemic of 1347 remains a reminder of how disease can alter the trajectory of societies. It stands as one of history's most significant turning points, measured not only in mortality but in transformation.